This is being recorded. Got it. Got it.
We have the American interference.
Yes, I'm going to go big. There we are. That's better. It's bigger. Yeah.
Okay. Julia, I just want to quickly introduce you, although I have sent out plenty of information to the group about you, and I'm sure many of them are already avid readers of your work. So this afternoon, I've got Julia Blackburn. She has written a huge number of books by my count, 13 nonfiction, 2 fiction, and 4 books of poetry. Over a career that now spans, well, since 1977, so a long time. I can't do the arithmetic on that one.
Oh, that's because, yes, I forget that it was 77, the first book, yes, or 78. Yeah, yeah.
Well, now, I'm quite fascinated by your career because I worked out that you had a conversation with somebody you called infinitely old, one Edith Young, and she mentioned Daisy Bates, and you said that I reckoned that happened to be in 1969, and you'd not written anything up to that point. It was another 9 years before you got to write anything, but you must have started writing by then, surely.
What I was writing from my early teens on was journals. I was always keeping a journal, and I think that I discovered early that if you write about your, things that observations. I started off by doing a journal which was full of, oh, help, this is terrible, it's all too complicated, I can't, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized that if I wrote a journal where I wrote about other things, like the weather or the pigs that I used to look after, or something like that, I myself reading it would know the kind of understory, if you like. So then I began to write more and more in a journal for the pleasure of writing and for keeping abreast with myself, I suppose, but then actually shifting to a book. That the first one was in, as you say, in 1978. And then I sat back and thought, well, now, who's going to say, we want another book from you, and nothing happened. And I was very slow with the connection between that and the next book. And then from, I suppose, 85, when did my second book come out? I don't know, but
89.
Exactly. And then I got on a roll. After that, I was on a roll. I did the 89 one, and then I realized that I could sort of put forward an idea like the Daisy Bates, which just sat in the back of my mind. And that the publisher would say, yes, go for it. So then I just worked on whatever came to mind.
But now the difference between the white men, which I've unfortunately not been able to find in South Africa,
yeah,
ironically.
Yes.
But the difference between, or let me put it this way, when we get to Waterton, there seems to me to be a difference between that book and Daisy Bates.
Absolutely. Yes.
And it is in Daisy Bates that you finally, or not finally, but you do get your stride. And suddenly that is the template for all the books that were to follow. Would you agree?
Absolutely. What I had with Waterton, which was, just for anybody who hasn't read it, it was quite a formal biography about a very nice, very eccentric naturalist and traveller called Charles Waterton. And there was one, I was remembering this, there's one sentence in that book where I say something like, how interesting it is when you're working on somebody and reading their letters and getting to know them, that you suddenly, it's like looking through the other side of a magnifying glass, of a telescope, that you see that, you go into that other time with a kind of little contained image. And funnily enough, my editor at the time, who I couldn't stand, said, you must cut that out. That's not part of biography. And I kept it in. And that was the little tiny hook of the sense of my connection with the subject, how you can become friends with somebody, as it were, through reading everything that they've written, through seeing photos, through going to the places that they went. So that was the first trigger of it. And after that, indeed, with Daisy, because she told so many lies, it was actually a friend of mine, this writer, Mary Wesley, who said, well, if she tells lies, you can invent her life. And that was a kind of liberation in thinking, where she and I went side by side, as it were.
Yeah. But in that book, you suddenly start introducing yourself all the time. Yes. And which you kept yourself out, as you said, until you found this one hook.
Yes.
And why did that suddenly become a very effective way of writing for you?
I think because of a kind of mistrust of objective history or objective biography or objective anything, life itself. And that because it was me in my rather kind of haphazard, slightly eccentric way of being, this was my interpretation. And so I felt that, and because I was always interested in entering other times, removing this sort of linearity of the life, as it were, and finding that it was possible, particularly with that Daisy Bates, of going to this extraordinary red desert of the Uldia Sok and meeting people who'd met her. It was a kind of liberation that it was me in relation to my subject became the essential dialogue, and that's kind of gone on ever since, and become, I suppose, a kind of style. But I try not to do it, and then it always comes back.
Well, no, I'm very pleased that you keep it in, because to me, it is what I find so enthralling about the books, is that you've managed to weave your personal life into these quite disparate subjects.
Yes, yes, it is fascinating how it works, and how you can, yes, and what I'm doing now, but that's, we can come to that later, but I'm trying to write something where I'm in the third person to make it more approachable, but trying to follow my own thoughts without a clear subject. But that's an extra bit. We go on from where you are now.
I mean, what I also find interesting about your career too is that with many of the books, Daisy Bates, Goya, the one with on what's his name, Chris, these are all, you have these intimations of these books way back early in your life, and they kind of sit in your head until the right moment, or somebody comes along and suggests something. So
yes,
I mean, are they there in a sense that you're thinking about them all the time, or does it come and go?
I think it's not there all the time, but there have been certain figures. I mean, with Napoleon, that was what was in my head, the book Emperor's Last Island. What was in my head there was not Napoleon, who I didn't find particularly interesting until he was a prisoner on the island of St. Helena, but it was the quote from Hamlet: I could be bounded in a nutshell and think myself king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. I found that such an interesting idea that I was kind of looking for somebody who would fit it, and then thought, well, Napoleon on an island has kind of got that, he was the king of infinite space, as it were, and then suddenly he's bounded in a nutshell. So I, rather against my better judgment, started reading about Napoleon, but I never read about him before he became a prisoner. I didn't want to get into the history and the bombast. I wanted just him once he's bounded. I've lost my thread of what we're saying, but that, so that there's different people. And then with Goya, as I say in the beginning of Goya, that then with that I was always fascinated by the book that my mother had of his Capriccios, and with Billie Holiday it's a long connection, and there's a nice bit in Alice in Wonderland when she's in Alice through the looking glass. She's sitting on a train, and there's a beetle in her ear who every so often says, you could make a joke about that, something to do with horse and horse. And I think with books that I have it that you suddenly think, gosh, you could make a book about that. And then usually I panic and think, how is it possible? Like with Billie Holiday, I'm not black or a jazz person or this or that, but then thinking, okay, I can do it because we share a kind of dysfunctional beginning. And on that we can put the boat out, as it were. And different things, so that it's an endless curiosity, I think.
I mean, that's the way it comes across. I mean, with Goya, for argument's sake, it seemed to me less about him and perhaps more about his deafness,
yes.
and your relation to, or his relation to the world, and then your relation to him through that. It's not only the people that you write about, but it's the circumstances around them.
Yes, absolutely. Well, definitely. I think that the Goya was very simply, I'd gone to see a painter friend in Madrid who took me to see the black paintings. And before I knew that Goya was deaf, there was this sense of a cacophony of noise from these black paintings, which he did in response to his deafness. So that was then a very interesting juxtaposition of ideas, as it were. And then I thought, this is crazy, that how can I write about a Spaniard? But it was possible to you know, by accompanying him. I think then I'm not pretending to write a biography, but I'm writing something which accompanies part of a person's life.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
When one reads through your books, one gets the impression that some of these subjects, a lot of them came about by accident, and somebody had to say something, and that sparks an idea, and you go pursuing the idea. Now, I'm quite happy that you say that that's just a device, but is it just a device, or is that the way things happen?
No, I think it does work like that. There was my father was a writer, was a poet, and he wrote a poem for me called For a Child, where he says, or maybe it's the other one, I think it's a different one, it's a different one. But anyway, he wrote two poems for me, and both of them were very important for me as kind of, and the one that I held to me very much, where he says a line where he says, as if she trusted that whatever happened is destined to occur. And I think that that's sort of that stayed within me somehow. It's not, I don't go kind of consciously looking for a book, but something comes up and says, this is possible. And I think, oh, I think I've lived my whole life slightly like that, of just thinking, oh, this is the next chapter that's taking place, and we'll see where it takes us. I'm not that I've been very haphazard in life, but I think with books that it's sort of incidental what you write about. That's maybe the crucial bit. The point is that you commit to it and you see where it takes you, but it's incidental what the actual subject is. You know, you can write about somebody stuck in a lift and that can become a whole book, or you can take a huge subject and it gets nowhere and it becomes stuck in its own lift. So I think it's that any subject that carries your interest then becomes an interesting subject.
All right, I will slightly disagree with you. I think it's anything that Julia Blackburn becomes interested in becomes a book. I'm not sure that the same would apply to all of us. But
Right.
is there a point at which you know that the story is going to catch, that you're going to continue? I mean, have you gone down blind alleys?
I'm very stubborn, so I haven't, I don't think. I'm struggling at the moment with something, but I think that I very often put the cart before the horse by going to my publisher and saying, this is what I want to write about with just a little bit. And they say yes. And that gives me a commitment to do it. Yeah. And then think, bloody hell, how am I going to do it? You know, so there's that. And I had two, I've lost them both now. I had two wonderful editors, Dan Frank and Dan Franklin, one in America and one here. And between them, they kind of carried me for 35 years or something. But now the one has died and the other is retired. But what were you saying?
Catching when the story catches and you then.
Oh yes, and I think there is a rule. There is a rule that I do hold to, and that is that once you've got to about 70 pages, you get to a bit where you can kind of hold it. You know, you print it out, hold the 70 pages. It feels like the beginning of a book. 70 pages. That's what I've always.
Wow, that's a lot of words.
It's a lot of words in 70 pages, but if you need to get to that, you know. But as I say, I don't think I've ever stopped a book that I've started, except the one that I'm doing now. I started it rather in a desultory manner and then have gone back to it. But usually I've just gone on. Yeah.
All right. I mean, you mentioned in the Carew book that you had to throw pages and pages and pages away. And eventually, after a year, you were left with some extracts. That seems to suggest that this is a very, very painful process.
No, I don't think I've never found writing painful, but the Carew, I think that I was very daunted by the fact that I'd taken on a whole, I thought it was such a, you know, you have this vast archive, first of all, of the Blake Lloyd archive of material collected mostly by Lucy Lloyd and by William Blake. You have that enormity. You have the enormity of a whole people with a whole culture whose voice is heard within the archive. And there's me as a bumbling sort of, you know, an outsider coming in and then only being able to stay for 2 weeks instead of for a month. Yeah. And it was the whole thing when I was trying to walk a very narrow thread all the way through. And I think with the beginning, I got swamped just by the sheer amount of material and how to let it speak without being overwhelming or without speaking to the converted, if you like, speaking, you know, in such a kind of particular language. How do you make it accessible? So I kept on copying out stuff and rewrite, you know, just trying to get to the point of getting familiar with it, even though it was too much in itself to get familiar with. And I did find it quite a frightening subject to take on, I must say. But it possibly benefited by being thrown, you know, having to rush back in a hurry on the 20th of March or whatever it was. And so I was completely curtailed in all my plans of what I was going to do in continuing my researches. And then there was a funny parallel between being cut off, because I was on my own here at the time, cut off by COVID, and the people themselves, that being cut off by the way that they, you know, what was happening in their lives and the life of their whole people. So that was then a sort of different tack to what I'd thought of doing.
All right. You talked about the voices, you hearing the voices as you went through transcribing and rewriting some of the extracts from the Blake archives. So it was a very intense and intimate time then.
It was very, very, yes, it was. I think that I've always had, since doing the White Men, which you haven't read, I've always had, for whatever reason, the White Men, if nobody's seen it, it was an anthology which started from something else. I did another anthology which didn't get published, and then I started this one. And doing an anthology was a way of getting into writing without the kind of commitment of writing too much. But it was about the first response of Aboriginal peoples to the arrival of us lot, to the colonial, the missionaries, the traders, the big game hunters, whatever it is, and how we were seen from the other side. And I felt that it was a way of looking at Western civilization, but just through these little excerpts. And within that, there are bits that come from, there's the Zosa thing of the cattle of the Zosa, that sort of famous, terrifying bit of, we will feed, because you're losing your ancestors. So you feed the ancestors with libations, with offerings, in order to say, for God's sake, we can't cope. You've got to rise up and help us. You get the same with the Plains Indians, you know. So there was that. There was a long history of the idea of having a people catching the voice before that voice was silenced, and the voice holding a whole world. And with the Kham, I found the voice so powerful and so complex and so moving that I was slightly overwhelmed. But I did get very close to the people, to certain of the speakers, and that helped.
Yeah, I mean, it was a brave thing to do, I thought, given cultural appropriation and
yes. It's got worse now. I mean, I think in the time since I wrote it, before it was published, then I suddenly, that everything got much tighter and harsher about, you know, what's this white woman doing, writing about another country and another, and black to white, all that kind of thing. And it got much, much rougher.
Yes.
Actually, I did have it. I was sort of, as mostly with books, I sit back and think, where's the Times review? Where's the Guardian review? Where's the something? And with this, it had a much more narrow range of reviews. I think because people said, oh, it's not quite appropriate to do it, you know. And so if I'd done it 3 years before, I think it would have had would have been heard more.
Oh.
But with this, that it was, I felt that I was treading more toes with it because of when it was published than if it had been published earlier. That was my thought. Does that make sense?
It does, but on the other hand, I felt it was very much your book exploring their world, but not appropriating it at all.
I didn't feel that I was appropriating, but I felt that I had a wonderful email from somebody in South Africa who was an academic, who said, dear Miss Blackburn, I'm writing to tell you that I've written a really critical book, a review of your book in this academic thing, although many of my colleagues think that I've been too gentle. And I was, you know, so that I thought, gosh, in that case, I better keep quiet. I didn't actually review it.
No, I'm sure. But on the other hand, you'd let them speak for themselves. I mean, you had just taken the extracts. Yes. You hadn't interfered with any of that.
Yes. I'd wanted to just give a voice to people who'd given a voice in the 19th century to the Blake family and archive, but to revoice it, if you like, and let them speak. And I found when I was writing it, when it got to the point where I could get these different peoples, like habo talking, or I can't do diakwen, however you say it, but those people talking, that it was incredibly moving to find a way of letting them speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And it really, yes, it was extraordinary to do.
Yeah, but I mean, that's what you have done in all the books, is let the people speak for themselves. Whenever
Yes.
you've got the character.
Yes, but they in particular needed to be heard, I think. I mean, it's rather like, I've always seen that kind of writing like jazz, you know,
Yeah.
where you have it, that you have a basic idea of what the, you know, it's going to be Ruby, my dear, or whatever it is, but then different people come in and do their solos. And I've always felt that with the subjects that I do, I have to let them come in and do their bit of speaking. Yes.
All right. Now this brings us to the next thing, is the research, which you so cleverly weave into your stories as well, so that the research becomes part of the topic. And there's a Henry James, I think it was, a visitation of things past.
The visitable past. Yes.
Which is such a wonderful thing, and which you've used throughout your books. It seems to me sometimes that you write these books in order to go traveling.
Well, you could think that, except some of the places I've been to have been so absolutely bleak that I would have had a better choice if I'd thought of going somewhere else.
Okay.
But no, I don't think I do it that way, but I do think I love that moment of connection between place and the past and the present, and the place and the person who was there. And I think I had it very much with with Goya when I went to the Doñana, where he'd been just after his deafness. He went and stayed in what was then a farmhouse and is now a UNICEF nature reserve center or something on this estuary. And that was where he'd kind of recovered from the shock, and he was with the Duchess of Alba. And you stand by the lagoon that he uses as the backdrop of his portrait of her, with that same light and the same whatever. But then there was a carob tree next to the lagoon, and all these dung beetles working. And you get this sense of, gosh, these are the same, you know, these are the same dung beetles with a few generations in between who knew Goya. It has a sort of very interesting, he'd have looked down, stood by that tree, which was old enough to have been there in his time, and seen dung beetles, because inevitably they would be there, because animals come to eat the fruit of the carob, you know. So that was that kind of thing is gives me a sort of step in, and just indeed just to go to the place where somebody was is you sort of shake hands across this great divide somehow by seeing what they saw.
Yeah, I mean, for you, it's vital that you do this research. Would you recommend it for everybody writing a non-fiction book?
I think to go where somebody has been is very important, if you possibly can. I mean, I think it's got an equal importance to the excitement one gets of looking at a diary or letters, and you see the handwriting, you see the whole, it contains much more than itself. And you do have there's a sort of intimacy that comes from reading somebody's letters or somebody's diaries. And I think I have the same with going to places. There's a very odd anticipation, which is always different to what you actually find. But it is very exciting. It's very, no, that's the wrong word. Anyway, I think it is. I think if you can, I think it's good, always. Yeah. And to allow, it's also that you know, it's like the Jerusalem Blake, you know, and did those feet in ancient times walk on these shores. You suddenly have it. There's a pulling back of this separation of time. But even though the person is dead, they have been there. Yeah, and that I think is fascinating, and not beyond fascinating. It gives one a way in. Indeed.
And that's what it feels like in the book. The book seems to be written while you're doing the research now. Or are you do you recollect in tranquility?
I think most of the books, usually because the subjects are so huge and I feel I have to go carefully step by step, I tend to do the research as I sort of chapter by chapter I have an overall idea, but I can't, as I get to a chapter, I think, God, I need to know more about this or that. And then I will do the detailed research within that chapter span, and then move on to the next. I mean, of course, I've read general books and other things, but for the actual getting what you actually need, I discover within a chapter, I think.
Okay, so are you keeping a journal then still to this day, quite rigorously?
I have, yes, I keep notebooks. I keep notebooks always, yes. They get rather, I think they become more muddled as I get older, that I go from personal stuff to research to a thought about a little poem or something and then back. You know, I don't have that. I try and put a title on the front of the notebook and then it doesn't always make sense. But I am yes, I always have. I have very nice big black notebooks and rather big scrawly handwriting, and I do keep them. Yeah. Okay. And always if there's something complicated going on in my life or in thoughts, then I find it crucial to write it down, to make it my own, as it were. It's always the same, that the process of writing gives one ownership of whatever it is you're writing about. It makes it your own, it transforms it.
And it seems to me to have been terribly valuable for you, because you're always able to quote from these books, from your journals.
Yes, oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, yes, absolutely. I can quote from the journals, but I can also, it's like the old blues song, I don't know where I'm going, but I do know where I've been. You know, and I think there's something with a journal, you see these, and the interesting thing, just recently, I was going back, because of what I'm doing now, I was going back to journals from the 1990s, and I've often find that I have a revelation of a very important thought, and then realize that I had that same revelation in 1990 as a first thought, and then again in 2000 and something. And each time again, I'm thinking, God, I've nailed it. Mm-hmm. So that's quite nice to see the continuity and also the kind of blinkeredness of one's way of thinking. I think one only has a very limited number of thoughts, probably.
You very, very bravely, I thought, took a step out away from your normal research and your normal way of writing to write 2 memoirs.
Yes.
Memoirs, and then The Three of Us.
Yeah.
The Three of Us particularly, I found an unflinching book. I mean, I think part of your style is a certain honesty. And I think you were unflinching in that book. I mean, was it a difficult book to write?
My editor, funny enough, when he said, let's, do it. And then I said, what kind of advice can you give me? And he said, the only advice I can say is be honest, be completely honest. He knew partly what it was about. There was that. And then there was the fact that my late husband then he'd been treated for cancer. And we thought that he wouldn't live, but he came through. And then he had another 8 years, 10 years to live after that. And there was something about the stripping back of everything, of having gone right up against the possibility of his death, and my own sense of, what that means, gave me a kind of thing of it wasn't the motive for doing that book, I needed to see what had happened. I suddenly really wanted to do it. So I did it in a way, although it's so personal, I wrote it like more of a biography than any book I've done, in the sense that I'd kept all my life, all these papers and notebooks and diaries from my parents and from myself, as if at one point I wanted to use them. And I finally went through them. I'd never had a reason to go through them, because I thought, for why, what purpose? Finally went through them. And once I'd gone through them, I actually flogged the whole lot to an archive which had connections with my father and myself, and it had other things. And so the whole archive that I'd had always with me from house to house through the years has now gone. And I just did it to see where it got to me. I didn't have any preconceptions, but it was a very forgiving sort of thing to go through. It was very interesting. I forgave myself, I think. I forgave my mother, particularly because she came around so nicely at the end and made that. I couldn't have written it if I hadn't had that reconciliation with her at the end. Okay. That was the real, because I couldn't write a memoir that's saying, vendetta.
Because that is the
So-
lovely part. I mean, it's an interesting thing for me because it's both dispassionate and passionate, and
Yeah.
throughout the book.
Yes.
And to achieve that note must have been quite difficult, I think.
Well, I had these wonderful faxes that I'd had with Herman in the time of my mother's last month, which meant that at however deep you went into the sort of chaos of that background, you could always come up for air at the end of each chapter with one of these, that you knew it was going to be all right. And that what to me was fascinating with that whole thing with my mother's and my relationship with her was that, like the idea of absolution, not that I'm a Christian in that sense or a Catholic in that sense, but you confess your sins on your deathbed and you're absolved. Yes. And there was something that it doesn't matter what happens, but if you can say, oh, that was all right, or that was tough, or that was something, that it can break a magic spell in such an interesting way. And I think that had happened. And so I could look at it. And then at a certain point, I thought I'm not giving my mother enough of a voice. So I did a chapter in her voice.
Yes.
Give her more of a chance to say what her side of things. Somebody asked me just recently with that chapter if she'd written notes, but no, it wasn't. It was just me trying to be her briefly.
Okay. There was an interesting quote I came across from Blake Morrison about being able to write, Blake Morrison. Yeah, about being able to write about his sister after her death. And you make much the same statement about your mother at the end of the book. So with that kind of memoir, would you advise wait for somebody's death before you write such things?
I think that, yes. I mean, my mother did actually say, oh, you'll be able to write about me now. I didn't, when she was on her last legs. But, not because she was, but because it had resolved. I think that, and I do think it does help. I got no brothers and sisters. I have no family, really. I have my children, and that, but I have no kind of people who can compare notes with my impression of my childhood, which was quite a liberation, I suppose. But I do think you don't want to hurt people who are alive. The ghosts of the dead might come and say you got that wrong, but I think if the living come and say, you've really upset me, that I think is pretty difficult to answer to. Yeah. And I think you can never, as I can't emphasize enough, you can never write from anger. It has to be from compassion on all sides, I think. Yeah.
Okay, good. Moving from the memoir to two things that you did earlier on in your career was to write 2 novels. And they both did very well, both shortlisted for the Orange Prize, but you felt and you've said that the landscape of fiction is too wide. What do you mean by that exactly?
It's funny, I always think I would like to write another novel, and then I'd never get round to do it. I can't do it. I think that for me, when I first was starting thoughts of writing, so this was when I was in my late teens, I did. So I was rather sort of evasive when you said that. I did try writing short stories, and I did try writing poems and things when I was quite young. But the whole thing of fiction, for me, I get too untethered. I find it almost frightening to not have the to invent people and then think, what the hell are they doing now, sort of thing, as opposed to trying to keep to a sort of reality or a sort of truth. And even then you think, what the hell's going on? But it's to me, it takes me too far out to be inventing people because I don't actually know them. I think that I have to face the fact that I'm not going to write more novels, although I would like to. I every so often I think of an idea and think, oh, that would make a nice novel. But there's a kind of stiffness in me that comes in making people up.
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does, but you did it very well, and clearly there was a market for it as well.
But I've tried. I've tried since then, and the thing that I'm doing now might be considered as a novel. I don't know, but it's very. I have tried, I promise, and it just hasn't worked. So that I don't know quite what to do about it. I sort of think, well, maybe in my last gasp, I'll do one more novel.
I was wondering about that. And then the poetry, I mean, does the poetry, is that something that comes easily, or is that of a different order?
That's all the ones that I've done. I mean, the first one was this, after Herman, my husband, died. I'd written notes about the sort of process of the last, because it was so moving, this last bit of his life, and he couldn't go on living. So, you know, and he was happy with that because he couldn't, he was become too weak. But still, he was very jolly and full of laughter. So I'd written about this in notes, and then I went to see a friend up who just lives across the fields here, who'd done this series of photos of the starlings. And that I suddenly thought with that gives me it gives a different dimension. I couldn't write about the mystery of life or the sort of edge of spiritual sense in the pieces of writing, because I find it very delicate to write that, but something of having these images of this the extraordinary phenomena of the myriad birds becoming one shape and one form and performing this ritual night after night, which in itself is like a kind of death, because they do it into the darkness, as it were, and then they all descend, made it possible to do that book, which went quite quickly. And then the next one I did was the Woman Who'd Always Loved Picasso, which was just directly in response to an exhibition at the Tate, Picasso 1932, which had most of the Tate modern filled with the paintings that Picasso had done in 1 year. And it was all to do with this Marie Therese. And it was an interesting, it overlapped with many different thoughts, but that was the root of it. And then a friend who lives around here did the drawings, which again helped to hold it. And the last thing was the one called The Wren, which is not really poetry, but that was, actually, I hardly knew her, but the woman who runs that press, Daphne Astor, who's now become a good friend, she was doing these little books very beautifully. And she said, I'd like you to write something for me. And I don't mind what you do, as long as you do it really fast. Because I'd like to have it in the next 2 months or something, you know, all done. And that was a very nice brief, because it meant that I think I did it in a month. Because that was what she wanted, and that meant that I could be very free with it.
Well, if you did it within a month, just let's get back to the actual business of writing. When you do sit to write, do you write for a specific number of hours a day? How do you discipline yourself?
Once I've got the kind of hold of the lizard's tail, as it were, once I've got a bit of a sense of what I'm doing, then ideally I would work from, well, this time now, but from about sort of 9:30, 10 through to, you know, and then depending how it goes. But then I also, when my kids were young, then I found it terribly important to be able to stop at the drop of a hat, or one coming home and saying, Mum, I've been sent home because I've got a headache, you know, that kind of thing. And also to stop at weekends and for holidays, to not be precious, because it's always yourself holding that story in your head. So even if you're interrupted by you know, something, that then you can always get back to it, because it's you're getting back to. And in fact, with this recent thing, I remarried in October, and then managed in my infinite cleverness to get pneumonia in November, then ended up in hospital. And I'd started writing something before, and then suddenly for 3 months I could hardly surface. I was so knackered. But in that time, it was interesting just to see that to have that confidence that you can get back to it, even if you feel that you've been slightly changed by being ill. I've not ever been ill before in my life, but that you can get back to it, and it's still there as it was. And then I write for as long as I can. But if I write, you know, and sometimes where you're completely exhausted because you forget how much brain energy uses energy, just like sort of running a marathon. But if it's going well, the great thing for me, which is possibly interesting for people within this group, of which I see a little bit, is that when it's going well, it's when you don't notice that you're writing. That I find so nice. Yeah. Okay. That you kind of wake up from it.
And do you go back the next day to read what you wrote the previous day?
Yeah,
And
I do a lot of rewriting. And I do a lot of reading it out aloud to see if it works. And I have it very often that I write something of it, one day, and then I'm really looking forward to reading it the next day. And as I start reading, I think, oh God, it's not, so then it needs to be redone and redone.
all right,
Yeah.
when you read aloud like that, are you recording it and play it back, or is it just your ear?
Just to myself, just to hear it in my head, just to hear it out loud and to see if the music of it works.
Right. Okay. And there is a specific music that you can hear in your own prose.
The rhythm, yes, I think it's the rhythm of the prose, and and if you read aloud, you also notice repetitions much better than if you just have it on the page, particularly with the computer page where everything looks so perfect, even if it ain't. So that there's something then in reading aloud that you hear it, and you can suddenly hear a bit of sort of an awkwardness, which you can't get from reading.
One of the interesting things that often comes up on the group is repetition, and people don't tend to hear the repetition, but you hear it as a discordant note.
Yes, if I'm repeating, and sometimes I like repetitions, of opening a sentence and then having the same word, of course. But if it's unintentional, that seems to be the only way for me of finding it, as I say, now that we all do computering things. The only way of finding it seems to be to read it aloud.
And Julia, when you get to the end of a manuscript, do you leave it for a while before you reread it? Do you send it off to your agent straight away? How do you treat that part of the process?
I tend to, again, when I had these two wonderful editors, I would, particularly at the beginning when I was always quite insecure, I'd sort of send them the first 4 pages and then 2 days later say, ignore that, here's another 4 pages, to try and, I find the beginning of a book terribly, terribly important. The voice that you've got at the beginning is crucial for how you're going to go on. So I always want to be able to go back to the opening pages and to see if that holds water, if that holds good. Yes. For the voice that I want to continue on. And then usually then, once I've got that established in my own head and I don't know anymore if I'm going to be doing this with editors because I have an editor, but it's a very different relationship. But then I need to go to the end, and then I used to go for something like Daisy Bates. I had an old friend in Holland, a Dutch writer who was 40 years older than me, I suppose. Very good poet, and I would go and stay with her and her husband, and I would go as if I was another person. It felt like putting on another hat. Say, oh, there's a manuscript here to be read, and I'd read it in the room that belonged to their daughter, who'd left home like the same age as me, was also a friend, and I'd feel that I was, in that way I could see it as like a stranger, because the worst thing is to read your own work with a kind of critical eye, because you know what's coming next. Yes. And you can ruin it that way. And I can remember doing the Goya book and saying to my husband, is anybody going to want to read it? Because it's so, we know what's happening, sort of thing. But that's just because it's within my bubble. Mm-hmm. So you've got to find some way of putting on another hat and saying, whew, what have we got here? Yes. Without that terrible personal critical thing from familiarity.
And in that rereading and the rewriting, have you ever ditched large sections of a manuscript?
Oh yes, often the best written bits, I think. Yes, the bits that are really kind of well written but not relevant. And I did have it with the Lover's Companion, one of the 2 novels, which took me ages. And somebody wrote a review and said, this is obviously a book that's been written very fast. It actually took me about 4 years to write it, because I'd finished it, and then I said something to my editor in America, how I said, it's very funny that it's as if I can see my own life in relation to this story that I'm telling, although it's not in the story. And he said, I'm very sorry, but I think it should be. So that was then another year trying to do it. But it's I've never ditched a whole long bit. I've never ditched and said the whole manuscript is wrong, but I have realized, I think with layers, I think more and more I begin to see how you can work with layers within a book. Mm-hmm. So it might be that a layer is missing and you can do that and open it out further. And I think I had that with Time Song and with Was Time Song my last book? I think. Oh no, the Karoo. That then the bringing, how to bring in the voice of the people became a layer that I could add more
True.
of as it went. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. If anybody wants to ask questions, please do so. We've got a couple more minutes left before Julia must go. So please, now's your chance.
Go and write a book.
You don't get this often enough, so please do ask anything. Julia, just one of the interesting things in sort of stalking you across the internet and so on, I came across a writing shed in your garden. Is that true?
Yes, we call it the fox house because my daughter used to keep orphan foxes there at one point. Yes, I've got a shed in the garden. Who was that from? Somebody asked for that photo recently.
Ah, okay.
Somebody, I'd never seen, yes, but there is a photo of the writing shed and me looking rather glamorous inside it.
And I believe too that if you don't write in there, you write on the kitchen table, or is that?
That's right, yes.
The mythology.
Yes, I write on, well, actually I'm in a little room now, which is a spare room, but also I also write here, but I need to have a bit of a view out. I have got that here, but I say that in the kitchen. I don't. I do write by, but when I'm writing on the kitchen table, it's kind of an accident. I start and then stay there. Yes, and I think one's also tethered by internet. I don't have internet up in what we call the fox house, and then you suddenly think you can't look up something or whatever.
Yes, yes. There's a question here. Do you have a favorite among your own books?
No, I don't think I do. I mean, I have them, I see them all with the story that they told me. But no, I don't think I do. I think I don't reread them much, no, at all. And I might look at something to try and remember something, but no, they're all part of, I like them for the process that they represent, but not as the favorite, no.
Okay.
I'm slightly ambivalent with the three of us, because with the three of us, I can have total strangers coming up to me and saying, I feel I know you very well. And then I think I have a kind of stock answer saying, no, you know me until I'm 20.
Wokeness, has that affected you in any way? Has it made you more cautious, more sensitive of what you do?
I forget what it means even. How about that? That's good.
I'm so pleased to hear that.
It's just being aware, sort of politically,
Yes.
racially, sexually, all these different things.
Indeed, yeah.
But I just try my best to yeah. And if there's something that I've said really wrong, I suppose then at some stage an editor will say, you can't say that anymore.
Yes, I mean, your earlier statement about writing from compassion would cover that too, I would have thought.
We'd hope so. Yes, yes, I think it's, yes. I mean, but I think I'm not, I don't have, I mean, I think that there's a complicated thing with these very, very delicate, I mean, now with the whole racial thing is complicated because obviously huge changes need to be made. And within that, then it becomes very dramatically necessary to say, you can't do this and you can't do that, you can't say, that sort of thing, which I understand. And I just hope that I can navigate my way around it. And I sort of try and cover myself with this strange story of my father with his racial complexity, but that doesn't make me an honorary something or other. I mean, it's it's just a bit that I understand a bit about it from that.
Yeah. Another question, will the current debate around the appropriation of cultures inhibit writers? This is from Sarah Wheeler in The Spectator, has warned about it apparently. Do you feel that is a situation?
The current what? The current
appropriation of cultures, so restricting you to a very limited range of subjects that you can write about effectively, I suppose.
I find it absurd. I find it absurd. It's like saying that Picasso, who I know in himself is not woke and complicated, couldn't paint a Minotaur because he hadn't met a Minotaur. I mean, it's we appropriate things in our lives if we identify with them. And if we identify and have empathy with them, then I think the empathy is the route in for writing about them. I don't think we need to be boxed off, but I probably, you know, that's probably not a very woke thing to say, but I think the whole nature of human nature is to allow osmosis, is to allow the you know, the connections between, whether it's time or individuals or predicaments or whatever. I have said, I think in my website, that I was always attracted to people in predicaments. And I think I always have been. And that's something which transcends all boundaries.
Indeed, and I mean, it also comes down to a matter of imagination, surely. And I mean, the imagination for fiction and the imagination for what you've done in non-fiction, it's still imagination. Yes,
yes. There's somebody saying, but you said your Peru story may not have been published earlier because of this. No, later. I think that it would, and I don't think it wouldn't have been published, but I think that I hadn't anticipated that it would be quite so precarious in some aspects because of particularly in the last 2 years shift of things. But I mean, I hold to it, and I don't think, and people have written about it without judging it that way, but it has a kind of precarious edge to it.
Good. Julia, I think that would wrap us up. I thank you very much for your very generous time, taking time out to do this. I'm really very nice of you to have done it, and I think everybody enjoyed it hugely, what you had to say. So thank you.
Good. All right, my pleasure. Well, very nice. On we all go with the writing life.
and thank you very much once more. More books, please. More books.
All right, I'm doing my best. I'm doing my best. All right. Yeah. Hey, bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Cheers.
Leave me.